The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Harriet Fletcher stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, her voice cutting through the dry Colorado air like the crack of a whip, and said, "Marry me." The man she said it to had not yet lowered his hand. That hand, broad, calloused, and raised with a quiet certainty that had silenced every other bidder in the yard, belonged to Henry Covington, a rancher of 32 years who had arrived in Cimarron crossing 3 days before the auction, and had done something none of the other men had bothered to do. He had walked the land, every acre of it. He had knelt in the red dirt and lifted it in his palm and studied the way it crumbled. He had followed the creek that cut through the northwest corner, checking its depth and the color of the stones beneath. He had counted the wild grasses, tested the fence posts, paced the distances between the well and the property line, and stood at the center of the acreage at sunrise and sunset to understand how the light fell and where the wind came from. He had done all of this quietly, methodically, without asking anyone's opinion, and then he had arrived at the auction on a warm October morning in 1873 and raised his hand when the bidding opened, and he had not lowered it since. Every other man who had come to bid on the Fletcher parcel had stepped back. Some had never intended to inspect the land at all. They had come on rumors that the land was cursed, that the soil was dead, that the widow Fletcher had let it go to ruin in the 3 years since her husband passed. But Henry Covington had walked it, and he knew those rumors were lies born of laziness and envy, and so he raised his hand, and the other bidders, one by one, had dropped out. Harriet had watched all of it. She was 27 years old, and she had been standing at the edge of the yard with her hands clasped in front of her, and her jaw set so tight it ached. Watching men, she had never trusted place numbers on everything her late husband Thomas had built, and that she had maintained alone since the spring of 1870. She had planted the garden that year herself. She had repaired the fence with her own hands and the help of her neighbor's 14-year-old son. She had kept the accounts, sold what cattle remained, haggled with the grain merchant in town, and absolutely refused to sell or abandon a single acre. But the bank had other ideas. The bank in Cimarron Crossing, operated by a man named Gerald Prout who wore too much bay rum and smiled with only his mouth, had decided that the debt Thomas Fletcher left behind was not manageable, and he had called in the note. So here she stood, watching strangers bid on her life. She had looked at each bidder with the cold precision of a woman who had learned to read men the way a hunter reads weather, and she had found every single one of them wanting. Calhoun Davies, who owned the stockyard, wanted the creek access. Silas Moorfield, who fancied himself a land developer out of Santa Fe, wanted to subdivide and sell. Harlan Prout, the bank man's nephew, wanted it simply because his uncle wanted the family to own it. None of them had walked the land. None of them knew what they were buying. None of them knew that the northeast pasture had the richest soil in the county, or that the creek never ran dry, or that the old cottonwood grove near the western boundary had been planted deliberately by the family that homesteaded the property before Thomas Fletcher bought it, as a windbreak. But Henry Covington knew all of that because Henry Covington had walked it. She had noticed him 3 days before the auction, the morning after he arrived. She had been carrying a bucket of feed from the barn when she saw a stranger moving through her pasture with a slow, deliberate stride, stopping occasionally to crouch and examine the ground or cup water from the creek in his hands and let it run through his fingers. She had gone to the fence and watched him for a long moment, and when he finally looked up and noticed her, he had not flinched or fumbled for an excuse. He had simply touched the brim of his hat and said, "I intend to bid on this land. I wanted to understand what I was bidding on. I should have asked your permission to walk it, and I apologize for not doing so." She had stared at him. Men did not apologize to her. Men talked over her and around her and about her, but direct, plain apologies were a rarity she had nearly forgotten existed. "What have you found so far?" she had asked, and he had told her. He had told her everything, straightforwardly and without condescension, about the soil quality and the water and the grass. He had pointed out a section near the southern boundary where the drainage needed work and told her how he would fix it. He had spoken about the land the way she thought about the land, as a living thing with particular qualities that had to be understood and respected. She had not told him her name. She had not said much at all. When he finished, she had picked up her bucket and gone back to the house, and she had sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning something over in her mind that she could not quite name. She had gone to the auction the next morning with her stomach in knots and her chin high. Now the auctioneer, a reedy man named Bart Elwood who wore a string tie and mopped his forehead with a handkerchief every 30 seconds, was staring at her with his mouth open. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. Somewhere behind her, a horse shifted its weight and blew a long breath through its nostrils, and that was the only sound in the yard. Henry Covington was still looking at her. His hand was still raised, suspended in that moment between bid and response, and his expression was not what she expected. She had expected shock or amusement, or the particular kind of male condescension that showed itself as a slow smile. Instead, he was looking at her the way he had looked at the land, with serious, attentive eyes that were taking in everything at once and arriving at conclusions she could not yet read. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and even. There was something from further east in it, some residue of a different upbringing, though it had been weathered by years out west. "I said marry me," Harriet said again, and her voice did not shake, though her hands were trembling behind the knot of her fingers. "Before you lower that hand, marry me and the land stays with the Fletcher name, and I keep what my husband built and what I've maintained for 3 years alone, and you get the best acreage in Cimarron County, and the woman who knows every inch of it." Bart Elwood made a strangled sound. Half the crowd erupted in murmurs. She heard Calhoun Davies say something low and ugly to the man next to him. She did not look away from Henry Covington. He lowered his hand, very slowly, and for one terrible second her heart dropped straight through the floor of her chest. Then he stepped forward out of the crowd and closed the distance between them until he was standing 3 feet away from her, and he looked at her with those serious dark eyes and said, "I don't know your name." "Harriet Fletcher," she said. "The land is mine by right if not by law, and I've worked it every day for 7 years. "Henry Covington," he said. He turned his hat in his hands once, a small nervous gesture that she noted with something like relief, because it meant he was not as composed as he appeared. "What you're proposing is either the most practical arrangement I've ever heard or the bravest thing a woman has said to a stranger in a public yard." "It's both," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The crowd watched. Bart Elwood had forgotten about his handkerchief entirely. "You know nothing about me," Henry said. "I know you walked the land before you bid on it," she said. "Every other man here would have bought it blind. That tells me more than most men manage to convey in a year of Sunday conversation." Something shifted in his expression then, something she would spend a long time later trying to describe and never quite managing. It was not a smile exactly, though the corners of his mouth moved. It was more like recognition, the quiet and startled kind, the kind that comes when you encounter something you did not know you were looking for. "If I say yes," he said, "we will have a great deal of talking to do before any official arrangements are made." "I have time," Harriet said. "So do I," he said. He raised his hand again. "Going once," Bart Elwood managed, snapping himself back to professional function, his voice cracking on the words. "Going twice sold to Henry Covington." The gavel came down. The crowd broke into noise, and Harriet Fletcher stood in the middle of it, feeling something she had not felt in 3 years. Something she had not expected to feel today of all days. Something dangerously close to hope. Gerald Prout, the bank man, shouldered through the crowd toward them both with his bay rum smell and his smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Covington," he said, ignoring Harriet entirely, "if you'll come to the bank by end of business today we can finalize the paperwork. The lady and I have some talking to do first," Henry said, and the easy, flat certainty in his voice stopped Prout mid-stride. "I'll come to you when I'm ready." Prue looked at Harriet then with an expression she recognized, the specific displeasure of a man who had assumed a woman was already beaten and found her still standing. He said nothing and walked away. Harriet let out a breath she had been holding since 7 that morning. "There's coffee at the house," she said, "if you want to begin that talking." "I do," Henry said. They walked together out of the yard, through the gate, and along the dirt road that wound back toward the Fletcher property, and they did not speak until they were out of earshot of the crowd, and then Henry said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Did you mean it?" She looked at him sideways. The October light was brilliant and hard, and it threw everything into sharp relief: the line of his jaw, the dust on his coat, the way he held himself like a man who was used to working in open spaces and carried that openness with him even in crowds. "I have never said anything I didn't mean," she said. "Not since I was 17 years old and discovered the cost of it." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. The house was a good house, solidly built, though it showed the strain of recent years in ways that only someone paying attention would notice. A slightly uneven step on the porch, a window frame that needed paint, the garden to the side that had more weeds than she liked but that she had not had time to address. Henry noticed all of it and said nothing, and she appreciated that. Inside, the kitchen was warm and clean. There was a shelf of books above the fireplace which surprised him, and she saw that it surprised him, and she said, "Thomas was a reader. I continued the habit after he passed." "What do you read?" he asked. "Whatever I can get my hands on," she said. "Mr. Emerson. Some law books I borrowed from Judge McAllister's widow, the Bible when I need patience." He almost smiled. "Do you need patience often?" "Daily," she said, and poured the coffee. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and what followed was the strangest and most earnest conversation Harriet Fletcher had ever had with another person. It lasted 3 hours. They spoke about the land first, because the land was the foundation of everything, and Henry told her what he had found during his inspection and what he intended to do with it. And she told him what she knew from 7 years of working it, and there were several moments when they both reached the same conclusion at the same time, and then looked at each other with the particular startlement of that coincidence. Then they spoke about themselves. Henry had been raised in Virginia, in a family that had owned land but lost most of it during the war. He had come west in 1866 with his brother Calvin, and they had worked cattle drives for 2 years until Calvin had saved enough to buy a small spread near Abilene. Henry had worked that land with his brother for another 3 years, but it was Calvin's land and Calvin's dream, and Henry had wanted something of his own. He had spent the past year moving through Colorado and New Mexico, looking, and the Fletcher parcel was the first land he had seen that felt right. Harriet told him about growing up in Ohio, about marrying Thomas Fletcher at 18, and coming west on a wagon with everything they owned packed in a trunk and 2 crates. She told him about the early years, which had been brutal and exhilarating in equal measure, and about Thomas, who had been a good man and a hard worker, and whom she had loved in the uncomplicated, daily, reliable way that she suspected was the most durable kind of love. She told him about the morning she had found Thomas collapsed in the south pasture, already gone, with no warning and no goodbye, just the terrible blunt fact of his absence. She told it plainly, without performance, and Henry listened with his full attention in the way she was beginning to understand was simply his way. "I am not asking you to be Thomas," she said when she finished. "I'm asking you to be a partner. Someone who will work this land alongside me and who will be honest with me. I have done 3 years alone and I can continue alone, but the bank has made that impossible and I am not willing to simply walk away." "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" she said, and there was something sharper in her voice now, something that 3 years of fighting alone had put an edge on. "Because I want to be clear. This is not a transaction where you acquire the land and I come with it like a piece of furniture. I am proposing a partnership, equal voice in the running of the property, equal standing in every decision." He met her eyes steadily. "I would not have it any other way," he said. I have seen what happens to land that's run by someone who doesn't listen to the people who know it best. I'd be a fool to own this ground and not consult the woman who's worked it for 7 years. She studied him for a long moment, looking for the seam in what he was saying, the place where the good impression cracked and the ordinary selfishness showed through. She did not find it. I need to know one more thing, she said. Ask it, he said. Why are you saying yes? You could buy the land without marrying me. Prout would sell it to you this afternoon. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to give her the careful answer or the true one. She watched him choose the true one. Because when you walked to that fence 3 days ago and watched me inspect your pasture, and then asked me what I'd found instead of ordering me off the property, and then listened to my answer without interrupting or dismissing a word of it, I thought to myself that the woman who owns this land is someone worth knowing, he said. And then today, when you stood up in that yard and said what you said, I thought to myself that I have never met anyone like her. And I am 32 years old, and I have lived carefully and worked hard, and I have the means to buy land without marrying anyone. But you are not a convenience, Miss Fletcher. You are the first person in a long time who has made me want to stay in one place. The kitchen was very quiet. Harriet put both her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, composing herself, because she was a woman who did not cry in front of people if she could help it, and something about the plainness and the precision of what he had just said had brought her unexpectedly close. All right, she said. Then we have a few practical matters to settle. We do, he agreed with that almost smile. The first practical matter was the bank. Henry went to see Gerald Prout that afternoon and paid off Thomas Fletcher's debt in full, in cash, from the modest but sufficient savings he had accumulated over 7 years of hard work and careful living. Prout's face during this transaction was, by Henry's later report, a source of quiet satisfaction. The second practical matter was the legal question of the marriage itself. Cimarron Crossing had a justice of the peace, a sober and decent man named Wallace Briggs, who had known Harriet since she arrived in the county, and who handled the formalities with efficiency and warmth. The ceremony was set for 3 days hence, which was fast by most standards but felt right to both of them, or so they agreed when Harriet walked Henry to the gate that evening and they stood in the cooling air with the last of the daylight streaking the sky behind the cottonwoods. 3 days, she said. 3 days. He agreed. He rode back into town on a bay horse named Deacon that was large and steady-tempered and matched its owner in that respect. Harriet watched him go, and then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table again, and the house was very quiet, and she found she did not mind the quiet in the same way she usually did. The next 3 days were full. Harriet had one friend in Cimarron Crossing whom she trusted completely. A woman named Miss Sutherland, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Abe, and who had brought Harriet food during the hardest weeks after Thomas passed. Mee was small and brisk and practical and had opinions about everything, which she expressed freely, and when Harriet came to the store the morning after the auction and told her everything, Mee listened in perfect silence for the first time in Harriet's memory and then said, "Well, I suppose you'd better let me look at that dress you have in the trunk." The dress was the blue wool one Harriet had worn to Thomas's cousin's wedding in 1869, and it was fine enough, and Mee helped her let it out slightly at the waist because 7 years of farm labor had put muscle where there had previously been none, and they pressed it with hot irons, and it was ready. Henry spent the 3 days productively as well. He moved out of the boarding house where he had been staying and began spending his days at the property, starting on the drainage repair he had identified during his inspection. Harriet found him working on it the morning of the second day, and she stood at the fence and watched him for a moment and then went and helped him, because she knew the land and she knew where the slope was wrong, and together they moved faster than either would have alone. They worked in companionable silence for most of the morning, and then they ate lunch together at the kitchen table, and the conversation came easily, moving from drainage to cattle to the price of feed corn to a book she was reading, and then to Virginia and Ohio, and the particular quality of autumn light in each place. He told her about his mother, a quiet woman who had kept a garden through the war and who had died of a fever in 1869, 2 years after Henry left. He said it plainly, but she heard what was underneath it. She said, "I'm sorry," and meant it, and he nodded and said, "She would have liked this land." "How do you know?" Harriet asked. "Because she liked useful things," he said. "Things that did what they were supposed to do and did it well." Harriet thought about that for a while. "That's a good way to think about land," she said. "It's the only way that works," he said. The morning of the wedding, Harriet woke before sunrise and lay in the dark and had a conversation with herself about what she was doing. She was clear-eyed about it. She had known this man for 6 days. She had spent perhaps 8 hours in his company. She was proposing to legally bind her life and her land to a stranger because he had walked her pasture and told her the truth about what he found, because he had apologized for trespassing without being asked, because he had stopped a bank man in his tracks with 5 quiet words, because he had looked at her in that direct and serious way, and said she was the first person in a long time to make him want to stay in one place. She knew it was unusual. She knew people in town were talking. She had seen the way Harlan Prout looked at her at the dry goods store the day before, with that combination of contempt and prurience that men like him deployed against women who did unexpected things. She had met his gaze and held it until he looked away. She was not afraid of what people thought. She had never been able to afford that fear. What she was slightly afraid of, and she admitted this to herself honestly in the gray pre-dawn, because she believed in honesty about her own interior state, was what happened after. What happened after the ceremony and the paperwork and the resolution of the immediate crisis? What happened when 2 people who had solved a practical problem together had to learn to share a house and a table and a life? What happened when the useful qualities that had brought them to this point ran up against all the ordinary human friction of proximity and difference and history? What happened when she started to care about him? She suspected, with a clarity that was more than a little alarming, that she already had started. She got up, dressed, made coffee, went to the barn and did the morning feeding, came back, put on the blue dress, and was ready when Miss Sutherland knocked on the door at 9 o'clock with a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers she had gathered from the field behind her house. "You look well," Miss said, which was Miss' highest form of compliment. "Thank you," Harriet said. "How are you feeling?" Harriet considered the question seriously. "Steady," she said. Miss nodded. "Good," she said. "Steady is good." They went to the Justice of the Peace's office together, and Henry was already there, standing outside with his hat in his hands, wearing a clean dark coat and a white shirt, and he had shaved close that morning. And when he saw Harriet coming down the street, he straightened slightly, and his expression was the one she was coming to recognize as his version of warmth, measured and real and not performed. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "You look—" He stopped himself. "You look well." She almost laughed because me had said the same thing. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." Wallace Briggs performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and a few words of genuine feeling, because he had known Harriet Fletcher long enough to wish her well with the full weight of that knowledge. He shook Henry's hand afterward and told him he had bought the finest piece of land in the county and married the most capable woman in it, and Henry agreed with both assessments without any apparent false modesty. Me cried, discreetly, into a handkerchief, and denied it immediately afterward. They had a simple wedding lunch at the hotel dining room, just the 4 of them, the newlyweds and me and Abe Sutherland, who was a large, gentle man who thought carefully before speaking and whose contributions to conversation were therefore worth waiting for. He raised a glass of water and said, "To the 2 of you, may you be lucky enough to grow into what you've already decided to be." And Harriet thought that was the finest toast she had ever heard. She and Henry walked back to the property in the afternoon, because they both had horses, but the day was fine, and the distance was not great, and walking suited them. The October light was doing something extraordinary with the cottonwoods, turning the leaves to hammered gold against the blue sky, and the air had the particular sharp sweetness of Colorado autumn. "I should tell you something," Henry said when they were halfway home. "Tell me," she said. "I am not an easy person to live with," he said. "I've been told I'm too quiet. I have particular opinions about how things should be done, and I don't always make those opinions clear until I've already acted on them." "I have been told I'm too direct," she said, "and too independent and too stubborn." "That sounds useful," he said. "So does what you said about yourself," she said. "We'll manage." The first week of marriage was, objectively speaking, an education in cohabitation. They were both people of strong habit and established routine, and there were several moments of entirely domestic friction. Henry's preference for working until dark running up against Harriet's firmly held belief that the supper hour was fixed and important. Henry's habit of leaving his coat on the chair by the door rather than hanging it on the peg 3 inches to the left. Harriet's tendency to make decisions about the property and then inform Henry of them as though they were already settled, which they were, from her perspective, but which felt to him like being handed a completed equation and asked to verify the answer. This last issue produced their first real disagreement, which happened on the 5th day. She had decided to move the remaining cattle from the north pasture to the south pasture, where the grass was better at this time of year, and she had arranged it with the Delaney boy who sometimes helped her with driving, and she had started on it before Henry was even back from checking the creek that morning. He came back to find the process half complete and said, carefully, "You might have mentioned this was the plan." "I have been making plans on this land for 3 years," she said. "And I have been on this land for 2 weeks," he said, still carefully. "I'm not suggesting you need my approval. I'm suggesting that if we're partners, it might be useful to have the same information at the same time." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, and she recognized, with the honesty she prided herself on, that he was right. "You're right," she said. "I'm accustomed to doing everything myself. I will work on that." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And I will work on saying what I think when I think it instead of waiting until I've already decided. That's fairer to you." They stood there in the north pasture with cattle moving around them and looked at each other, and Harriet thought, with a quality of feeling she was not quite ready to name, that this was what she had asked for when she said partnership. This exact thing. The friction and the acknowledgement and the forward movement. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and went to help with the driving. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was, gradually and then suddenly, the best rhythm Harriet had known in years. They worked hard: the drainage project, the fence repairs, the preparation for winter, the culling and selling of the cattle, the laying in of supplies, and they worked well together, which was not a thing she had taken for granted. Hard work and good partnership were not the same thing, and she had known enough people who were capable of one without the other to understand the value of the combination. Henry was, as he had warned her, a man of quiet habits and considered opinions, but she discovered that he was also genuinely funny in a dry and understated way that caught her off guard and made her laugh with a fullness she had almost forgotten, and that he had a particular tenderness toward the working animals, the horses and the dogs, that revealed a softness underneath the reserve that she found unexpectedly moving. She found him one morning talking to Deacon while brushing him down, telling the horse at some length about his assessment of the drainage situation, and he did not know she was there until she said, "Does he have opinions?" And he turned around without embarrassment and said, "He nods occasionally, which I take as agreement." She laughed, and something happened to his face when she laughed, a brightening that he could not entirely suppress, and she filed that away in the growing catalog of things she knew about Henry Covington. In the evenings they sat by the fire, and sometimes they read, and sometimes they talked, and the talking was the best of it. He had opinions about everything, about farming and politics, and the particular injustices of the land grant system that had stolen so much from the people who had been here first. And on this last subject, he surprised her with the depth of his feeling. He had seen enough in his travels through the territory to understand what was being done to the Comanche and the Apache and the Arapaho peoples, and he spoke about it without the casual dismissiveness that most men of his background employed. "My brother thinks I'm soft on the matter," he said one evening. "He doesn't understand why I think the treaties matter." "Because they were made and then broken," Harriet said, "repeatedly, and that has a cost beyond the immediate suffering, which is already enormous. It says something about what we are." "Yes," he said, "exactly." She looked at him across the firelight. "Your brother," she said, "will he come to visit, do you think?" "Eventually," Henry said. "He'll want to see what I've done with myself." He paused. "He'll be surprised." "About the land." "About you," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of anything ornate or calculated, landed somewhere near the center of her and stayed there. It was in November, on a cold, clear night about 3 weeks after the wedding, that the thing she had been carefully not naming announced itself to her with complete and ungovernable clarity. She had been unwell for 2 days, a winter cold that had laid her low, which she resented bitterly, because she had too much to do and no patience for her own physical frailty. Henry had said nothing about her stubbornness in this regard, which she appreciated, but he had quietly ensured that the firewood was always plentiful, that there was broth on the stove, that the animals were seen to, and that she was left to rest without fuss. On the 3rd day, when the worst of it had passed, and she came downstairs to find the kitchen warm and a cup of tea already made and waiting, and Henry sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, making notes about the spring planting schedule, she stood in the doorway for a long moment before he noticed her. When he looked up, his face did that thing, that brightening, and he said, "How are you feeling?" With a directness of concern that was entirely unperformed. "Better," she said. "Thank you for everything." "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said firmly. "Don't minimize it." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "You're welcome then." She sat down across from him and drank the tea, which was exactly the right temperature and the right strength, and she looked at the planting notes he had made and saw that he had accounted for everything she had told him about the soil and the drainage and the seasons, and something inside her, something that had been tightly held since the morning of the auction and maybe since longer before that, let go. She loved him. She did not say it, not that morning. She sat with it for several days, getting used to it, turning it over, examining it with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything. It was real. It was not gratitude, though she was grateful. It was not relief, though she was relieved. It was something she recognized as the same fundamental quality as what she had felt for Thomas, but different in character, less innocent, more chosen, with the weight of everything she had lived through since giving it a specific gravity that was entirely its own. She wondered what he felt. She had evidence, but evidence required interpretation, and she was a careful interpreter. The answer came unexpectedly, as answers often do. It was the last week of November, and they had ridden out together to check the fence line along the north boundary, which had been repaired but needed review after the first heavy frost. The day was cold and still, the sky a pale, hard blue, the cottonwoods stripped of their leaves now and standing like silver etchings against the horizon. They had worked their way along the fence, making notes, and they were coming back toward the house in the late afternoon light when Henry's horse, Deacon, shied at a jackrabbit that burst out of the scrub brush, and Deacon landed wrong and pulled up lame. Henry was off the horse in an instant, and Harriet was beside him a moment later, and they crouched together and ran hands down Deacon's left foreleg, and Henry's face was tight with concern. He found the tender spot, just above the fetlock, and the horse leaned against him and blew a shaky breath, and Henry put his forehead against the animal's neck for a moment, just a moment, and closed his eyes. Harriet sat back on her heels and watched this, and the tenderness of it, the uncomplicated love of a man for a horse he trusted, hit her somewhere undefended. They walked Deacon carefully back to the barn, Harriet leading her own horse, Henry walking beside Deacon and talking quietly to him the whole way, and they got him settled and examined, and she said it was a soft tissue strain, not a break, and they would know better in a few days of rest. Henry stood in the barn door in the fading light, and Harriet was washing her hands at the water pump, and she said, without planning to, "You're a very good man, Henry Covington." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came to stand beside her close, and he said, very quietly, "I have been trying to think of the right way to say something to you for the past 3 weeks." "Say it," she said. "I think I love you," he said. "I say I think not because I'm uncertain, but because I want to be honest that this is fast and unusual, and I know that. And I would rather tell you honestly what I believe to be true than give you something polished and unreliable." Harriet turned off the water pump and turned to face him. His expression was so carefully open, so stripped of any protective irony, that she felt the full weight of what it had cost him to say it. "I think I love you too," she said. "For the same reasons you qualified it, and for the same underlying certainty." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the first purely tender gesture he had made toward her, and his hand stayed at her jaw for a moment, and she put her hand over his, and they stood there in the cold evening air between the house and the barn, and let that be sufficient. Winter came down over the Fletcher property with the particular severity of Colorado altitude, and with it came a kind of sustained closeness that tested the declaration they had made in the barn doorway and found it durable. They were indoors together for long stretches, and the friction of cohabitation that they had begun to work through continued its education. They learned each other's limitations and tolerances and preferences, with the patient thoroughness of people who were genuinely interested in getting it right. Henry learned that Harriet needed silence in the mornings before she had been awake for an hour, and that she would forgive almost any mistake once but not twice, and that she expressed affection through action rather than words, and that when she was worried about something she cleaned, and the frequency and intensity of the cleaning was a reliable barometer of her interior state. Harriet learned that Henry's quietness was not distance but a different kind of presence, and that when he did speak at length it was worth every word of waiting, and that he was, underneath the deliberate and composed exterior, a man of considerable feeling who had learned to manage that feeling through years of circumstance that had required him to be solid for other people, and that being allowed to be uncertain or tender in her company was something he was only gradually learning to trust. They read to each other in the evenings, taking turns, and argued about politics and history and religion with the vigorous pleasure of two well-matched minds, and made plans for the spring with the serious collaborative joy of people who had something genuine to build. Calvin Covington arrived in the second week of December, which was not expected. He rode up on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, which was entirely consistent with how Henry had described him. A man of action and impulse where Henry was a man of deliberation, warm and loud where Henry was warm and quiet. He was 2 years younger than his brother, with the same dark eyes and a considerably larger capacity for noise. He came through the door of the Fletcher house saying, "Henry, I cannot believe you got married without," and then stopped when he saw Harriet standing at the kitchen stove and said, "Oh, hello." "Hello," she said. "You must be Calvin. I'm Harriet." Calvin looked at his brother with an expression that clearly said several things at once, and Henry said, "Come in and close the door, Calvin. You're letting in the cold." Calvin stayed for 4 days, which was 3 days longer than the expected visit, because he found the property genuinely impressive, and because he found Harriet Covington, as she was now legally named, to be exactly the kind of person he would have hoped his careful and exacting brother would find. He said this to Henry on the evening of the 3rd day, loudly enough that Harriet could hear from the other room, and then said even louder, "She can hear me, can't she?" "Yes," she said from the other room. Calvin laughed with the full-throated freedom of a man who found life generally amusing, and Henry looked at the ceiling with an expression of resigned affection, and Harriet set down her book and laughed too, and it was one of the best evenings of the winter. When Calvin left, he shook Henry's hand and then hugged Harriet, which surprised her, and said, "You take care of him. He pretends he doesn't need it." "I know," she said. "I already do." Calvin rode away down the road, and Henry came to stand beside her on the porch, and she slipped her hand into his without thinking about it, and he held it without making anything of it, and they stood there until Calvin's horse rounded the bend and disappeared. "He's wonderful," she said. "He's exhausting," Henry said. "Both things are true," she said. "Both things are always true with Calvin," he agreed. Christmas came, their first together, and Harriet made the dinner herself, a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and a dried apple pie from the apples she had put by in the fall, and Henry brought out a bottle of good whiskey he had been saving, and they ate at the kitchen table with candles and the fire, and it was simple and entirely sufficient. He gave her a copy of the complete works of Emerson, which he had ordered from a bookseller in Denver, and which she held in both hands and stared at for a long moment before she looked up with bright eyes and said, "How did you get this?" "I wrote ahead," he said simply. "In October." In October, she thought. He had ordered it in October, before the wedding, before she had said the words in the yard, before any of this was certain. He had ordered it while he was still just a man inspecting land he was considering bidding on, and she had been the woman who came to the fence and asked what he had found. "You ordered it in October," she said. He understood what she was saying. "I did," he said, with that directness she had come to rely on. "I thought about you afterward. I saw your books on the shelf. I thought you might like it." She put the book down on the table and reached across and took his hand, and they sat like that for a long time in the candlelight, and outside the snow was falling in the particular soft silence of a Colorado winter night, and inside it was warm. Spring arrived in March with the dramatic reluctance of high-altitude seasons, flirting with warmth and then retreating into cold, and Harriet and Henry worked the land through its contradictions with the focused energy of people who had been planning for months. The drainage repair they had completed in October proved its worth immediately, directing the snowmelt away from the low section of the south pasture and into a runoff channel that fed the creek. Henry watched this with a satisfaction that was entirely unpretentious, and Harriet said, "You knew it would work," and he said, "I hoped it would work. Knowing comes after." They planted in April, with a plan they had made together through the winter and refined 6 or 7 times, consulting each other at every stage. And the process of that consultation had become so natural and so functional that Harriet sometimes caught herself marveling at it, at the ease of a partnership that had started as a calculated necessity and become something so far beyond calculation that the original practicality seemed almost beside the point. In April, she told him she thought she might be pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper, plainly and without preamble, because plain and direct was her way. She watched his face very carefully. He was still for a moment, and then something happened to his expression that she had never seen on it before, an opening, a complete and undefended joy that was so enormous it seemed almost too large for his habitual containment, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took both her hands in his and said, "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she said, "but I think so." "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I'm going to be sick in the mornings," she said, with the slightly grim humor that was her way of handling physical discomfort, "and like everything is going to be all right." He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her knuckles, and the room was very quiet. "Everything is going to be all right," he agreed. The spring was full and busy and beautiful in the way of Colorado springs, with wildflowers appearing in the fields and the cottonwoods coming back to life, and the creek running full and clear. And Harriet worked through the early months of her pregnancy with a stubbornness that drove Henry to the edge of his considerable patience on more than one occasion, because she would not slow down. "The doctor said rest more," he said one evening in May, watching her carry a crate of tools to the barn. "The doctor is a man of 63 who has never worked a ranch a day in his life," she said. "He has a medical degree, and I have a perfectly functional pregnancy and work that needs doing." Henry looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his concern against his respect for her autonomy, and she loved him for the fact that he was actually weighing it rather than simply defaulting to the convention that a pregnant woman should be confined to a chair. "Half the crate," he said. "Let me take half." She handed him half the crate without comment, and they walked to the barn together, and she thought, this is what partnership looks like. Not one person overruling the other, but two people finding the middle ground without losing their footing. The summer was long and golden, and the land did everything Henry had predicted when he first walked it and crouched in the dirt and looked at the soil between his fingers. The northeast pasture produced grass so thick and rich that the cattle moved through it with a contentment that was almost comical. The creek ran steady. The garden Harriet had planted was the best she had ever grown, yielding tomatoes and beans and squash in quantities that filled the root cellar and still left surplus to trade at Miss Sutherland's store. Gerald Prout rode out in July to inspect the property, ostensibly on bank business that Henry had immediately identified as entirely pretextual. Prout walked around the yard with his bay rum smell and his non-smile, and made several observations that were clearly intended to diminish the property's evident prosperity, and Henry listened to all of it with the flat, quiet attention that Harriet had privately come to think of as his rattlesnake face, entirely still and entirely dangerous. And when Prout was finished, Henry said, "The debt is paid in full, the property is ours, and your bank has no further business here. Thank you for riding out." Prout left. Harriet watched from the porch, and when Henry came back to the house she said, "Rattlesnake face." "I beg your pardon," he said. "That expression you make when someone is being insufferable and you are deciding the most efficient way to remove them from your vicinity," she said. "I call it your rattlesnake face." To myself. He considered this. "I'm not sure how to feel about that." "It's meant as a compliment," she said. "The rattlesnake is an efficient animal." He shook his head, and the smile that usually did not quite break surface did, briefly and completely, and it was, she thought, the finest smile she had ever seen on a person. The baby came in November, a month before Harriet expected him. He was a boy, as it turned out, born on a Wednesday evening during a light snowfall, with the doctor, who had a medical degree, in attendance, and Miss Sutherland also present by virtue of the fact that she had arrived the moment Henry rode to fetch the doctor, and showed absolutely no intention of leaving. The labor was long and hard, and Harriet endured it with a ferocity that alarmed the doctor and impressed me, and Henry sat with her through most of it, holding her hand with the particular steady kind of presence that was his specific gift. And when the baby finally arrived and made his first announcement of himself to the world, Henry's face did the opening thing again, larger this time, and he made no attempt to contain it. They named him Thomas James Covington Thomas for Harriet's late husband, whose memory she intended to honor honestly, and James for Henry's father, whom he had lost in the war. Thomas was, from the first days of his life, an alert and determined person, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had Henry's dark eyes and Harriet's stubbornness, a combination that Miss Sutherland said when she came to visit and hold him was either going to be magnificent or absolutely unmanageable. "Probably both," Henry said. "In succession," Harriet agreed. The winter that followed was the best winter Harriet Fletcher, Harriet Covington, had ever spent on the property that was now, inarguably and completely, hers. The year that followed Thomas's birth had the quality of a fully inhabited life. The land thrived, and the couple who worked it thrived alongside it, and the rhythms of their days had the depth of people who had genuinely chosen one another and continued daily to make that choice. There were difficulties, because there are always difficulties. There was a dry spell in August of 1874 that threatened the hay crop, and Henry and Harriet spent 2 anxious weeks managing irrigation and watching the sky, and the hay came through short but sufficient, and they sat on the porch in the August heat and let themselves be relieved. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Cole Beaumont, who had decided the creek ran through his property and not theirs, a dispute that required Judge McAllister, who was still alive and sharp at 80, to produce a survey document from 1869 that settled the matter conclusively in Harriet's favor. Henry, who had been inclined to let the legal process work, nevertheless stood beside Harriet at every stage of the dispute in a way that made it clear he was not neutral, and Beaumont eventually came to the fence post where the survey markers were, and shook both their hands with the grim dignity of a man accepting a well-earned defeat. There was a day in the spring of 1875 when a letter came from Virginia, forwarded through Calvin in Abilene, informing Henry that his elder brother William, who had stayed east and worked the remnants of the family property, had died of a fever. Henry received this news in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning and sat with it in silence for a long time, and Harriet sat with him and did not talk, and when he finally spoke he said, "I left when I should have stayed. I always knew I left too soon." "You could not have known he would die," she said. "I know that," he said. "I know that." Here he put a hand to his head, but not entirely here. He moved his hand to his chest. She moved to sit beside him instead of across from him, and she put her arm around him, and he leaned into her slightly, which was the most unguarded thing he had ever done, and they sat like that for a long time until Thomas in the next room registered his opinions about being unattended with sufficient volume to require a response. Henry stood up, wiped his face with his hands, and went to see to the baby. Harriet heard him talking to Thomas, that quiet, steady voice explaining things, and the tightness in her chest eased. The spring planting of 1875 went beautifully. Henry had refined his understanding of the northeast pasture over 2 full seasons now, and his management of the soil and rotation was producing results that drew comments from other ranchers in the county, 2 of whom came to ask his advice on their own drainage situations, which he gave freely and without condescension. Harriet, watching him talk to the Hendricks brothers from the neighboring property, thought, "He came here knowing it was good land, and now everyone knows it is good land, and they know it partly because of him, and he has never once suggested that the land's reputation is his achievement rather than the land's own character." That was the kind of man he was. Miss Sutherland had a daughter that spring, her 3rd child and first girl, and Harriet was there for the birth as me had been for Thomas's, and the 2 women sat together afterward in the clean aftermath of new life, and me said, "Are you thinking about a sibling for Thomas?" "I am thinking about it," Harriet said. "We have not discussed timing yet." "You should discuss it," me said, with the brisk authority of a woman who had opinions. "I know," Harriet said. "We will." They did that evening, which was one of the conversations that Harriet remembered with clarity years later, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and Thomas asleep in the next room, talking about the future the way people talk about it when they genuinely trust each other, openly and without performing certainty they don't have. "I would like another," she said, "when we're ready." "I think we're nearly ready," he said. "Are you?" she asked. He thought about it, which was his way, genuinely and without rushing. "Yes," he said, "I think so. This house has room for more and we have enough to give more." "We do," she said. She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and outside the evening was settling into the particular deep blue of a Colorado spring night, and somewhere on the south pasture a coyote called once and was answered by another, and the house was warm. In the summer of 1875, Harlan Prout, the bank man's nephew, who had bid at the auction, tried to spread a story around Cimarron Crossing that Henry Covington had misrepresented himself at the time of the auction, that there were questions about the source of the money he had used to pay off the debt. Henry heard about this from Abe Sutherland, who had heard it at the barber shop, and Henry went to see Wallace Briggs, the justice of the peace, and then he went to see Gerald Prout, and then he went to find Harlan Prout in the saloon where Harlan was most commonly found in the early afternoon. Harriet was not present for this conversation, but she heard about it from 3 separate people by the end of the day, which was the measure of how efficiently news traveled in Cimarron Crossing. Henry had, by all accounts, been entirely calm. He had sat down across from Harlan Prout, and placed in front of him a letter from the First National Bank in Abilene, Kansas, documenting the origin of the funds, 7 years of wages and savings, entirely clean, entirely legitimate. And he had said, quietly and in front of sufficient witnesses, that if Harlan Pruitt repeated the story, Henry would have him in front of Judge McAllister for defamation, and that Judge McAllister had a long memory and no patience for the Pruitt family. Harlan Pruitt had not repeated the story. That evening, Harriet said, "You should have told me before you went." "I handled it," he said. "I know you handled it," she said. "That's not the point. The point is that we handle things together." He was quiet, and then he said, "You're right, I defaulted to dealing with it alone. I'll tell you first next time." "Thank you," she said. "You would have come with me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I went alone. I didn't want him to have the satisfaction of seeing it bother you." She looked at him for a long time. "Henry," she said, "the things that bother me are mine to manage. You do not need to protect me from them." "I know that," he said. "I know it here." He touched his head. "But not always here." He touched his chest. She smiled then, because it was the echo of what he had said about William, about knowing something in one place and not entirely in another, and she appreciated that he had offered her that openness. "I love you," she said, "even when you're infuriating." "I love you," he said, "even when you're absolutely right and I wish you weren't." She laughed, and he reached across the table and tucked that strand of hair back from her face, the gesture that was his, that he had been making since the evening in November when he told her he thought he loved her, and she leaned slightly into his hand as she always did. By the fall of 1875, the Fletcher Covington property, as it was increasingly known in the county, was one of the most productive small ranches in the area. Henry's careful management of the soil and the drainage, combined with Harriet's 7 years of knowledge of the land's specific character and her sharp instinct for when to sell and when to hold, had produced results that were visible and concrete. They had increased the cattle herd by 30 animals, the garden surplus had become a consistent source of trade income, and Henry had planted a stand of winter wheat in the northwest section that was, in its second growing, doing something remarkable. Harriet was pregnant again by October, which she told Henry one morning in the kitchen with the same direct plainness she had used the first time, and his face did the opening thing again, though this time with slightly more composure and slightly more joy, as though he had the first time as a template now and could inhabit the feeling more fully. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better than last time at this point," she said, "which I take as a good sign." "Harriet," he said, and then stopped. "What?" she said. He shook his head slightly. He paused, finding the words with the care he always gave them. "I want you to know that this life, this exact life, is more than I understood was possible when I came to this county. I didn't know I was looking for this. I looked at the land and I found you, and you were better than the land." She stared at him. "Henry Covington," she said, "that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, and you have said some very fine things." "The land is exceptional," he said. "Do not undermine it," she said. "I'm not undermining it," he said. "It's exceptional. You are more." She stood up from the table because she needed to do something with what she was feeling, and she went to him and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back with the solid, sure warmth of a man who had learned that being held was not a diminishment. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I love you," he said into her hair. "Every day more specifically." "More specifically," she said. "I know more of you every day," he said. "So the love is more specific, more accurately aimed." She pulled back and looked at him with the full light of what she felt for him, not managing it or measuring it, just letting him see it. "You are a remarkable person," she said. "So are you," he said. "That's the whole of it." The second child was born in June of 1876, a boy again, healthy and loud, with Harriet's light eyes and Henry's deliberate manner, which appeared even in infancy as a quality of watchfulness that made the doctor laugh. They named him Edmund Calvin Covington, Edmund for a great uncle of Harriet's who had been a schoolteacher, and Calvin for Henry's brother, who received a letter informing him of the honor, and responded with a letter of his own that was 3 pages long and almost entirely illegible with enthusiasm. Thomas, who was 2.5 and fully possessed of the alert determination that had been his character since birth, inspected his new brother with an expression of serious assessment, and then patted Edmund's head with one careful hand and said, "Mine," which Harriet took as acceptance. With 2 children and a thriving property and 3 years of marriage behind them, the Covington household had achieved a fullness that was not static but dynamic, changing with the seasons and the children's growth and the land's own rhythms. Harriet had become, by 1876, a figure of some regard in Cimarron Crossing and the surrounding county, not because she performed ambition or sought recognition, but because she was known as someone who was honest and competent, and whose judgment on matters of land and weather was reliable. Henry was equally well regarded, for different but complementary reasons. He was trusted for his thoroughness and his consistency, for the fact that he did not speak until he had something worth saying, and did not promise what he could not deliver. Together, they were the kind of couple that other people pointed to when arguing about what a partnership could look like. Miss Sutherland told people about the auction. She had told the story so many times it had become a legend in the county, slightly embellished in the retelling but essentially true. And the story always produced a reaction in the listener that was half disbelief and half something that looked very much like longing. Gerald Prout retired from the bank in 1877 and moved to Denver, and Harriet did not pretend to be sorry about it. His replacement was a younger man named Hargrove who was competent and fair, and who extended the Covingtons a line of credit that same year on the strength of their track record, which they used to expand the winter wheat operation into the full northwest section of the property. Judge McAllister died in the spring of 1877, and his funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county, and Henry and Harriet were there. And after the service Henry said, "He was a fair man," which was his highest form of tribute, and Harriet agreed. Calvin Covington came back for a proper visit in the summer of 1877, this time with his wife, a lively and sharp-tongued woman from Tennessee named Ruth, who took to Harriet immediately, and with a directness that equaled Harriet's own, so that by the second day of the visit they were arguing about the best rotation for corn and beans, with the energetic pleasure of 2 people who have found a worthy match. Henry and Calvin worked the south fence together for 2 days while their wives argued agriculture inside, and in the evenings all 4 of them sat on the porch in the warm Colorado darkness and talked and laughed, and the children ran between the adults' legs until they were herded to bed. Calvin said on the last evening of the visit, with Ruth beside him and both the Covington brothers' children asleep inside, "You know what Pop would have said about all this?" "What?" Henry said. "He'd have said Henry found himself a piece of land worth having and built something on it," Calvin said. "And he'd have been looking at Harriet when he said the land worth having." Harriet looked at Calvin across the porch. "That's very kind," she said. "It's the truth," Calvin said. "And Ruth agrees with me, which is how I know I'm right." "You're right," Ruth said. "More often than you deserve, Calvin, but you're right about this." Henry shook his head at his brother with an expression of resigned and genuine affection, and Harriet reached over in the darkness and found his hand and held it, and the evening went on around them, easy and full. By the fall of 1877, Thomas was nearly 4 and Edmund was 1.5, and the property was producing at a level that had exceeded even Henry's careful projections. The winter wheat had been a success in its first full year of the expanded operation, and Henry had begun corresponding with an agricultural extension from the state about soil management, which the extension had expressed genuine interest in given the results Henry had documented. Harriet had taken on the bookkeeping for Miss Sutherland's dry goods store in addition to their own property accounts, because Me's husband Abe had a bad hand from a childhood injury that made writing painful, and Me had no patience for figures. This added income was small but consistent, and it was Harriet's own separate professional work, which she valued on principle. One evening in October, with both boys in bed and the house settling into its night sounds around them, Henry said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "The school in town," he said. "Thomas will be old enough in 2 years. But the school is 4 miles from here, and the teacher they have is—" He paused. "He does his best." "He does," she said. "He does his best with 40 children and one room and not enough books." "I've been thinking about whether there's a way to supplement it," Henry said. "Something for the children in this end of the county. A small subscription school, perhaps in the Hendricks' old barn. They're not using it." Harriet looked at him. "Who would teach it?" "You," he said, "if you wanted to. You have more education than anyone I know out here, and you've been reading law books and Emerson for 7 years." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Would require time I don't have unless we reorganize some things," she said. "We can reorganize some things," he said, "and I would need proper materials." "I'll correspond with Denver," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through," she said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 months," he said. "I wanted to be sure it was a realistic proposition before I brought it to you." She looked at him across the lamp. "Henry," she said. "Yes. You are a consistently good man," she said. "I want to make sure you know I notice that." He held her gaze. "I notice the same about you," he said, "daily." The subscription school opened in January of 1878 in the Hendricks barn, with 12 children aged 5 through 12, and Harriet teaching from a shelf of books and a set of slates she and Henry had ordered from Denver. She taught arithmetic and reading and history and some basic natural science. And she was not a soft teacher, but she was fair, and she was interested in her students as individuals, which they responded to with the immediate loyalty that children extend to adults who take them seriously. Henry managed the ranch through the teaching days with what she privately calculated was remarkable efficiency, reorganizing the work schedule so that the essential tasks were accomplished and nothing fell behind. He was never, in word or action, resentful of the time she gave to the school, and she knew enough about the world to understand that his equanimity on this subject was neither inevitable nor common. Spring came to the property again, and with it the particular exhilaration of the growing season beginning. Thomas had grown tall and curious, and had a habit of following Henry around the property and asking questions that Henry answered with complete seriousness, crouching down to Thomas's level and explaining soil drainage or fence maintenance with the same thorough care he would apply to an adult conversation. Edmund was walking now and had recently discovered strong opinions about everything, which he expressed with a conviction that made Harriet and Henry look at each other over his head, with the shared humor of parents recognizing themselves in a small person. On a morning in April of 1878, nearly 5 years after the auction where it all began, Harriet woke early and went outside before the household stirred and stood at the fence by the northeast pasture in the gray dawn light. The land was doing what it had been doing for those 5 years, producing, growing, sustaining, being exactly what she and Henry had understood it to be when they each, separately and then together, had looked at it with the patience required to see truly. She heard the door behind her and his step on the porch, and then the soft crunch of his boots on the ground as he came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his side, and they stood together in the April morning watching the light come up over the pasture. 5 years ago this month," she said. "The 5th of October," he said. "The auction was the 5th. You walked this land on the 2nd," she said. "I saw you from the barn." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I saw you watching me." She turned her head to look at him. "You didn't say." "I was hoping you didn't mind," he said. "And then I thought, if I walk it carefully enough, if I show her I understand what this land is, maybe she won't mind." "You were trying to impress me," she said, "by doing soil drainage calculations." "I was trying to show you I understood the value of what you'd built," he said, "which is the same thing, more or less." She looked up at him, at the face she knew now with the depth of 5 years of daily proximity and genuine love, at the dark eyes and the jaw and the particular quality of attention that he brought to everything and everyone he cared about. "I raised my hand before I'd met you," she said. Technically, he agreed. "But I had already decided I wanted to know you. Before I said marry me." "Before you said marry me," he confirmed. She turned back to the pasture. The light was full now, golden and clear, falling across the grass in the way it did at this time of year that she had loved since the first spring she spent on this land. "We should think about expanding the school," she said. "There are children further east who can't make it to town." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that too." "Of course you have," she said, with the warmth that was always underneath her directness when she spoke to him. "I've also been thinking about the North Field," he said. "I want to try oats this year." "Oats," she said. "The soil composition is right for it and the drainage is good now." "Show me," she said. And so they walked, as they had walked the fence line and the creek and the pastures and the property boundaries so many times before, side by side in the April morning, talking about oats and soil and the school and the children and the summer coming. And the land spread out around them in all its productive, well-tended, genuinely understood glory, and there was no part of it that was not exactly what they had together made it. A year later, in the spring of 1879, Harriet told Henry she was expecting a third child, and he received this news with the same opening joy of the previous 2 times, and she told him that the school had grown to 23 children, and that she was writing to a friend in Ohio about teacher training materials. And he told her the oats had done beautifully, and that he wanted to try a small apple orchard on the eastern slope. And they ate supper together with Thomas, who was 5 now and already reading with an aptitude that the subscription school teacher, his own mother, noted with a combination of pride and determination not to favor him, and Edmund, who had opinions about supper every night and was developing a talent for drawing that showed itself in charcoal marks on any available surface, including walls, about which Henry had the patience of a saint. The house had been added to, a back room and a proper larder, and it was a house now in the full sense of the word, a place that held history and habit and the particular evidence of lives fully lived. Calvin wrote from Abilene that he and Ruth were thinking of moving west, drawn by what Calvin called, in his sprawling, enthusiastic hand, the evident fact that Colorado is where things are happening, and that my brother and his remarkable wife are at the center of it. Henry read this letter aloud at supper, and Thomas listened seriously and said, "When is Uncle Calvin coming?" And Henry said, "When your Uncle Calvin makes a decision, we will all know immediately because your Uncle Calvin is not quiet." And Harriet said, "That is accurate," and even Edmund, who did not yet fully follow the conversation, laughed because everyone else was laughing. On a September evening in 1879, Harriet's third child arrived, another boy they named George William George for Harriet's father, who had died before she moved west, and William for Henry's elder brother, whose loss Henry had carried quietly and whose name would now be spoken every day in a house of warmth and abundance. George came into the world with the full-lunged enthusiasm of a person who intends to be heard, and he achieved this goal immediately and consistently. He had Harriet's coloring and what appeared to be Calvin's disposition, which Henry noted with an expression that Harriet read as resigned affection mixed with genuine delight. They had 3 boys: Thomas, Edmund, George. The house was full of their noise and their specific characters and their questions and their discoveries, and every evening when the house settled and the children slept, Henry and Harriet sat together in the kitchen or on the porch or by the fire and were, in those quiet hours, exactly what they had agreed to be on that October morning in 1873, partners, equal and genuine, in everything that mattered. The land was everything Henry had known it would be when he crouched in its soil and let it run through his fingers. The creek never ran dry. The northeast pasture was as rich as the best farmland in the county. The cottonwood grove along the western boundary stood against the wind every winter and sheltered the horses. The winter wheat and the oats and the garden and the cattle produced, year after year, in the reliable and generous way of land that is properly understood and properly treated. The school grew until it required a proper building, and the county funded a small schoolhouse in 1880 on land that Henry and Harriet donated for the purpose. Harriet taught in it 3 days a week, and in the years that followed, children from across the eastern part of Cimarron County learned to read and figure and think under her instruction, and several of them went on to further education. And one of them, a girl named Clara Hendricks, became a schoolteacher herself and wrote to Harriet years later to say so. Calvin and Ruth did move to Colorado in 1881, settling a property not far east of Cimarron Crossing, and the two families became a fixture of each other's lives. Sunday dinners that started as occasional became monthly and then fortnightly, with 6 children between the two households and 4 adults who genuinely liked each other. And the noise and the cooking and the argument and the laughter of those evenings became one of the best things about their lives. Harriet kept her books. She added Whitman to the Emerson and borrowed a copy of Darwin from Judge McAllister's widow, who had kept her husband's library intact. She read to the boys in the evenings, starting earlier than most people thought appropriate, and Henry read to them too. And what happened was that they grew up with books as a natural part of life, unremarkable and necessary as bread. On a morning in the fall of 1883, 10 years after the auction, Henry took the boys out to the northeast pasture and showed them the soil, exactly as he had shown Harriet on that first day, crouching down and lifting a handful of earth and letting it fall between his fingers. Thomas, who was 9, understood immediately and asked 3 precise questions. Edmund, who was 7, drew what he saw in the dirt with a stick. George, who was 4, ate some of the soil and was firmly redirected. Harriet watched from the fence, and when Henry looked up and saw her there, he raised his hand, not in the gesture of a bid but in the simple acknowledgment of seeing her, and she raised hers in return, and between them, across the field and the years and the dailiness of everything they had built, what passed was the particular and durable language of 2 people who knew each other to the bone and had chosen, every day, to go on knowing. They were not perfect people. They were people of specific flaws and particular habits, and the accumulated small grievances and large kindnesses of any long marriage. But they were honest and they were present, and they had built on solid ground, both the ground beneath their feet and the ground of their choosing each other, and what they had made would outlast them in the children and the land and the schoolhouse and the small accumulated dignities of a life lived in genuine partnership. Miss Sutherland said, the following spring, at one of the Sunday dinners that had become one of the sustaining rhythms of all their lives, "You know, I was there. I saw it. I've told the story 100 times and I still can't believe she said it." "What part?" Ruth asked, who had heard the story but always wanted to hear it again. "The part where she walked up to a complete stranger at a property auction and told him to marry her before he lowered his hand," Miss said, "in front of the whole town." "I had reasons," Harriet said. "You had reasons," Miss agreed. "Very good reasons, as it turned out." Henry looked at Harriet across the table, past the plates and the children and the noise, and his expression was the one she knew best, the warm and attentive and entirely unperformed look that she had first seen in the kitchen on the morning he came to drink coffee and talk about the land, the look that said, "I see you specifically, and I choose you specifically, and all of this is because of that." She looked back at him with the full weight of what she knew and felt and had built over 10 years of mornings and seasons and difficulties and revelations, and what passed between them required no words and used none. "You were right," he said. "About which part?" she said. "About all of it," he said. "You were right about all of it." Outside the dining room window, the Colorado evening was doing its particular spectacular thing with the October sky, turning it colors that no painter had yet quite managed, and the cottonwoods were gold again, as they had been gold on the morning of the auction, and the land lay around the house in the deep contentment of well-tended ground, And in the kitchen, Me was already cutting pie, and the children were already asking for it. And the two families were already at the particular pitch of noise and warmth that was the specific music of their joined lives. And Henry Covington, who had walked the land before he raised his hand and had found, in the woman who came to the fence to watch him walk it, something better and truer than anything he had known he was looking for, reached across the table and covered his wife's hand with his. And Harriet Fletcher Covington, who had stood in a public yard and proposed marriage to a stranger before he could lower his hand, and had been right about him in every way that mattered, turned her hand over and held his. And the evening went on around them, exactly as good as it was, and as good as it would continue to be, for all the years that followed.